Before you scroll past another recipe, let me take you to the moment the lights dimmed, the fondue pot bubbled, and every dish on the table had a story. By the end, you'll have a handful of 70s classics worth bringing back, and you might recognize the one that defined your family. The 1970s were a wild era for food. While a few dishes became enduring classics, lots of remarkable recipes slipped into the past. Today, we are bringing some of those back. These are the recipes from the 1970s you really should try in your lifetime. From casseroles that stretched every dollar to party bites that defined a decade, these foods capture a chapter of American culinary history worth revisiting. So cue your favorite disco song and let us dive into the most unforgettable foods of the 1970s. Swedish meatballs. In the 1970s, no cocktail party felt complete without a slow cooker loaded with Swedish meatballs. These small, flavorful bites were the highlight of any gathering. Tender, savory meatballs bathed in a lush, creamy sauce kept guests returning for seconds. Although their popularity in America peaked in the 1970s, Swedish meatballs trace back centuries in Scandinavian cooking. What made them ideal for 70s entertainment was how easily they could be made ahead and how universally appealing their flavor was. The key to authentic Swedish meatballs was not only the meat blend, traditionally a mix of beef and pork, but also the signature sauce. Unlike Italian-style meatballs served in tomato sauce, Swedish meatballs sit in a gravy made from beef broth, finished with a bit of sour cream, and lifted by the spice that gives them a Scandinavian note. A hint of nutmeg, sometimes with a touch of allspice. Today, these meatballs are still a beloved comfort food, with many modern takes that lighten the original or offer plant-based alternatives. Quiche Lorraine. When Americans in the 1970s wanted a touch of refinement, they reached for quiche Lorraine. This French-inspired dish became the star of countless brunches and ladies' luncheons across the country. With its flaky, buttery pastry shell filled with a silky blend of eggs, cream, bacon, and Swiss cheese, it embodied everything fashionable about French cooking at the time. Quiche Lorraine was not actually a new invention of the 1970s. It originated centuries ago in the Lorraine region of France, but it became a household name in America after Julia Child introduced French cooking to home cooks. What made it so well suited to the era was its flexibility. You could serve it hot or at room temperature, which made it perfect for entertaining. It could be made ahead of time and reheated, and it worked just as well for breakfast, lunch, or a light dinner. By the end of the decade, quiche had grown so fashionable that it inspired the 1982 bestseller Real Men Don't Eat Quiche, a tongue-in-cheek take on how the dish had become linked to women's luncheons and a certain sophistication. Fondue. Nothing evokes 1970s entertaining like a fondue pot placed in the middle of the table. That communal meal, where guests dipped bread cubes into a pot of melted cheese, was more than food. It was a social occasion. Fondue traces its roots to 18th century Switzerland, but in America, it became the definitive emblem of casual yet sophisticated entertaining in the 1970s. The classic cheese fondue used Swiss cheeses such as Gruyere and Emmental melted with white wine, garlic, and a hint of cherry brandy. The ritual came with its own rules and tools, long-handled forks color-coded for each guest, and earthenware pots that kept the cheese at the ideal consistency. What made fondue especially suited to the 1970s was its interactive quality. In a time before smartphones and social media, it physically brought people together, prompting conversation as they shared a single pot. The custom even carried playful penalties: cheese logs and cheese balls. Before the era of cheese boards and chutney plates, the 1970s party spread was dominated by the modest cheese ball and its cylindrical cousin, the cheese log. These retro hors d'oeuvres often took center stage at cocktail parties. They typically combined cream cheese with cheddar, blue cheese, or port wine cheese, molded into a sphere or log, then rolled in chopped nuts, herbs, or spices. The appeal of the cheese ball was its make-ahead convenience. Hostesses could prepare them days before, wrap them in plastic, and refrigerate until it was time to entertain. Then, surrounded by a spread of crackers, they quickly became the centerpiece of the appetizer table. The cheese ball's roots go back well before the 1970s, but it reached the height of its popularity during that decade. When processed cheese products were seen as modern and refined, the most famous commercial example was Hickory Farms beef and cheese gift sets, which turned into a common holiday present. While a basic cheese ball used only a few ingredients, inventive hostesses invented endless variations with mix-ins like chopped olives, pimentos, or green onions. Carrot cake with cream cheese frosting. The 1970s were not only about savory fare, they also produced dessert staples that lasted. Arguably the most cherished is carrot cake with cream cheese frosting. This dessert captured the decade's curious contradictions. It included vegetables, giving it an air of wholesomeness, yet it was usually finished with a rich layer of sweet, tangy cream cheese frosting. Carrot cake's history goes back to medieval times, but the contemporary American version, topped with cream cheese frosting, became a sensation in the 1970s. The era's growing interest in natural foods and whole ingredients helped carrot cake move from novelty to mainstream. Food historians observe that the 1970s recipe often featured not only grated carrots, but also crushed pineapple, shredded coconut, and chopped walnuts or pecans. What truly distinguished 1970s carrot cake was the cream cheese frosting, a perfect counterpoint to the warmly spiced cake. Before this period, carrot cakes were often glazed or finished with a boiled frosting, but the tangy cream cheese topping became inseparable from the cake in that era. Watergate salad. Few dishes embody the 1970s fascination with convenience foods better than Watergate salad. It is an odd, yet oddly satisfying mix of pistachio pudding mix, crushed pineapple, marshmallows, and whipped topping, all folded together into a pale green fluff. The origin of its name remains shrouded in mystery, much like the scandal it alludes to. Some people say it first showed up at the Watergate Hotel, while others insist a reporter quipped that it hid whipped topping the way the Nixon administration hid things. Kraft Foods, the maker of Jell-O pistachio pudding, rode the wave of its popularity but originally labeled it Pistachio Pineapple Delight. Home cooks, though, clung to the Watergate story, and the name endured. The salad's appeal went beyond the quirky title. It summed up what Americans liked about modern cooking in the 1970s. Fast to assemble, no actual cooking required, reliant on shelf-stable staples, and carrying that semi-homemade charm that let homemakers feel inventive yet practical. Beef stroganoff. In the 1970s, beef stroganoff was the go-to dinner party entree for hosts who wanted to impress without overspending. This Russian-inspired plate featured tender strips of beef in a rich, tangy sauce made with sour cream, most often spooned over egg noodles. The original 19th century Russian dish was more refined, usually using high-quality beef tenderloin, but the 1970s American take often economized with ground beef or cheaper cuts. What made stroganoff ideal for the era was its exotic-sounding name paired with straightforward preparation. It offered an international flair that made dinner feel special, yet stayed within reach of everyday cooks. The common 1970s version typically folded in cream of mushroom soup to give the sauce body without the fuss of making a traditional roux-based sauce. Some inventive cooks splashed in cooking sherry or white wine for extra polish. The dish was commonly finished by stirring in a generous spoonful of sour cream at the end, producing a creamy sauce that clung to both meat and noodles. Pineapple upside-down cake. Pineapple upside-down cake was not a 1970s invention. It dated back to the 1920s, when canned pineapple became widely available. Still, it hit its stride in the 1970s, appearing at potlucks, in lunchboxes, and serving as the triumphant finale of family dinners. What made this cake stand out was its theatrical reveal and the exact harmony of flavors and textures. The classic take had rings of canned pineapple and maraschino cherries laid out in a pattern on the bottom of a pan. then sprinkled with brown sugar and dotted with butter so that the mixture caramelized while baking. Cake batter was poured over that sticky, sweet layer, and once baked, the pan was inverted to expose the shiny fruit design. The 1970s version commonly relied on a boxed yellow cake mix as its base, another sign of the era's embrace of convenience cooking. The finished dessert delivered several contrasting sensations in every mouthful: warm, gooey caramel topping, juicy pineapple, and soft, airy cake beneath. Pasta Primavera. When Americans in the 1970s wanted a touch of continental flair without leaving the country, they gravitated toward dishes like Pasta Primavera. This vibrant pasta, piled with fresh vegetables, became a hit in restaurants and soon showed up in home kitchens nationwide. Legend says that Pasta Primavera was invented in 1975 by New York chef Sirio Macchioni, the owner of the famous Le Cirque restaurant. What made Pasta Primavera so right for the 1970s was how it matched the decade's growing taste for lighter, fresher fare. After years dominated by heavy casseroles and meat-centric meals, people were ready for plates that put vegetables front and center. The traditional version presented a bright mix of barely cooked vegetables, commonly broccoli, carrots, peas, and bell peppers, tossed with pasta and dressed in a sauce that could range from olive oil and parmesan to a delicate cream sauce. What distinguished 70s Pasta Primavera from older pasta dishes was that the vegetables were treated as the main attraction rather than merely an accompaniment. It was a dish that celebrated fresh flavors and color. French onion dip with potato chips. Some pairings become so embedded in our food culture that we forget they had an origin. French onion dip served with ridged potato chips is one of those combinations. A party classic that came to define casual entertaining in the 1970s. The dip began humbly. In the early 1950s, an unknown cook is said to have stirred Lipton's French onion soup mix into sour cream, and an instant favorite was born. By the 1970s, that simple mix had become the unofficial dip of America. What made onion dip ideal for the 1970s was how easy and appealing it was. Anyone could make it. Just two ingredients mixed together. Yet the result tasted like far more than the parts. The tangy sour cream base combined with the savory, slightly sweet onion seasoning to create an addictive flavor that matched perfectly with the salty crunch of ridged potato chips. The 1970s version was almost always built from packaged soup mix, though some enterprising cooks made from scratch versions. It was usually presented in a bowl nestled at the center of a larger platter, with potato chips arranged in concentric circles around it. What was the dish that always showed up at your family gatherings? Swedish meatballs, ambrosia, or something only your household made? Chicken a la king. Chicken a la king might sound upscale because of its French-tinged name, but in the 1970s it stood as the epitome of practical comfort food. This creamy preparation of diced chicken, mushrooms, and peppers in a rich sauce became a go-to weeknight dinner and a favorite method for using leftover roast chicken. While the dish dates back to the late 19th or early 20th century, it reached peak popularity in American home kitchens during the 1970s. The typical 1970s version featured chicken in a creamy white sauce with mushrooms and pimentos or bell peppers for color and flavor. It was often served over toast points, biscuits, or puff pastry shells, the latter being especially popular for more formal occasions. What made chicken a la king right for the era was its flexibility and usefulness. Home cooks could use fresh or canned mushrooms depending on availability, and the sauce could be made from scratch or simplified with cream of chicken soup. It was also an excellent way to stretch a small amount of chicken to feed a hungry family. Tuna noodle casserole. Few dishes embody the practical home cooking of the 1970s better than tuna noodle casserole. This modest but filling mix of canned tuna, egg noodles, and cream of mushroom soup, often finished with crushed potato chips or breadcrumbs, was a regular on many American dinner tables. Tuna casserole first appeared in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when cooks looked for ways to stretch inexpensive protein. and it reached its peak of popularity in the post-war decades, becoming a bona fide American classic by the 1970s. What made tuna noodle casserole so well suited to the 70s was how it matched the era's emphasis on convenience and thrift. It depended on pantry staples kept on hand for an easy evening meal. A can of tuna, a bag of egg noodles, and a can of cream of mushroom soup made the core, with optional additions like frozen peas, diced celery, or grated cheese. The recipe is usually baked in a single dish, which kept cleanup to a minimum. Another bonus for busy families. Black Forest Cake. When Americans in the 1970s wanted a truly show-stopping dessert, they often chose Black Forest Cake. This striking German import, with layers of chocolate cake, whipped cream, and cherries, stood for the height of dessert elegance. The authentic Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte came from Germany, but American adaptations became hugely popular in the 70s, sometimes taking liberties with the traditional formula. The classic form featured layers of chocolate sponge brushed with cherry liqueur, filled with whipped cream and sour cherries, and finished with chocolate shavings and extra cherries. The American 1970s version often simplified things by using canned cherry pie filling instead of fresh sour cherries, and frequently left out the traditional Kirsch cherry brandy to make it more family-friendly. What made Black Forest Cake ideal for the era was its theatrical presentation. Tall, clearly layered, and decorated on top. Baked Alaska. If there was one dessert in the 1970s that could truly be called a showstopper, it was Baked Alaska. This astonishing mix of cake, ice cream, and meringue seemed to break the rules of physics. How could ice cream survive being put into a hot oven? The explanation, of course, was the insulating quality of the fluffy meringue coating, which shielded the frozen center during its short moment under the broiler, or for the most dramatic presentations, when it was set alight at the table. Although Baked Alaska was not born in the 1970s, its roots go back to the 19th century, it enjoyed a revival in that decade. The classic version had a layer of sponge cake topped with ice cream, the whole encased in a cloud of meringue and browned quickly under very high heat. What made Baked Alaska ideal for the 70s was its mix of retro elegance and theatrical flair. In an era before social media, this was a dessert that made an occasion memorable. The gasp as it arrived at the table, the thrill of the flaming finale, and the surprise of finding cold ice cream inside a warm exterior. Crêpes Suzette. In the 1970s, when Americans wanted the feel of dining in an elegant French restaurant without leaving home, they turned to crêpes Suzette. This dramatic dessert of delicate pancakes in a boozy orange sauce, often flambéed at the table, stood for the height of sophisticated entertaining. Though crêpes Suzette dates back to late 19th century France, it became a fixture of American gourmet cooking in the 70s, helped along by Julia Child's influence and a growing national taste for international cuisine. The classic method involved making thin French pancakes, crêpes, which were folded and bathed in a sauce of butter, sugar, orange juice, and an orange liqueur. The grand finish called for pouring extra liqueur over the dish and setting it aflame, producing a spectacular blue fire that caramelized the sugars and burned off some of the alcohol. What made crêpes Suzette perfect for the 70s was its stagecraft and showmanship. Home entertaining during the 1970s often included theatrical elements. Beef Wellington. When it came to standout main courses in the 1970s, few dishes matched the grandeur of beef Wellington. This lavish preparation centered on a tenderloin of beef coated with pat and mushroomed excel, then enclosed in puff pastry, was the quintessential special occasion supper. Although beef Wellington has English roots, it rose to prominence on American dining tables in the 1970s as a symbol of upscale entertaining. The traditional method began by searing a beef tenderloin, then spreading it with liver pate and a finely chopped mushroom and shallot mixture seasoned with herbs. That assembly was wrapped in puff pastry and baked until the crust turned a deep golden. When carved, the rosy, perfectly pink center of the beef contrasted with the layers of mushroom pâté and the flaky pastry. What made beef Wellington ideal for the 1970s was the mix of luxurious components and dramatic presentation. It demanded significant time and money, so it was usually reserved for genuinely special events. Chicken Kiev. Chicken Kiev brought an element of Eastern European sophistication to American dinners in the 1970s. This rich dish featured boneless chicken breasts pounded thin, wrapped around a nugget of herb-seasoned butter, then breaded and fried until crisp and golden. When sliced, the melted butter would gush out, creating a sauce for the chicken and delivering a moment of culinary drama. Though Chicken Kiev has a Russian provenance despite its Ukrainian name, it gained widespread popularity in the United States after frozen versions reached supermarket freezers in the 1960s. By the 1970s, enterprising home cooks were preparing it from scratch, and it also turned up on restaurant menus as a refined choice. The classic method required a lot of hands-on work, pounding chicken breasts flat, enclosing a roll of compound butter without letting it leak, then breading and frying so the outside became crisp, while the meat stayed moist and the butter melted without oozing out too soon. Part of Chicken Kiev's appeal in the 1970s was that mix of refinement and indulgence. The reward came when someone sliced through the crunchy coating and the herb-scented butter flowed out. Chicken and dumplings. In a decade that welcomed both global flavors and comforting home cooking, chicken and dumplings summed up traditional American fare. This filling, heartwarming dish, tender chicken in a rich broth crowned with fluffy dumplings, had long been a staple in American homes, and it enjoyed renewed interest in the 1970s as people returned to home-style recipes. The dish grew out of Southern cooking and Depression-era thrift when it stretched a little meat to feed many. By the 1970s, it had moved beyond those modest roots to become a widely loved comfort food. The classic version called for simmering a whole chicken to yield both tender meat and a flavorful stock, then dropping spoonfuls of biscuit-like dough on top so they steamed into independent dumplings. What made chicken and dumplings fit the 70s was how it matched the era's twin tastes for convenience and from-scratch cooking. Regional takes varied. Southern recipes often used rolled, flat dumplings, while Northern cooks usually relied on dropped biscuit-style dumplings. Waldorf salad. The 1970s brought back several American classics, and few returned more fully than Waldorf salad. That crisp mix of apples, celery, walnuts, and grapes tossed in mayonnaise became a regular at luncheons, potlucks, and holiday spreads during the decade. First created in the 1890s at New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the salad changed over the years and settled into the form most associated with it by the 1970s. The classic 70s version used crisp, tart apples and celery for crunch, walnuts for richness, and red grapes for sweetness, all tossed in mayonnaise that was often lightened with a bit of whipped cream or sour cream. What made Waldorf salad ideal for the 70s was its mix of freshness and familiarity. It was substantial enough to serve as a main course at ladies' luncheons, yet flexible enough to turn up as a side dish at dinner. It hit the sweet spot between healthy ingredients and an indulgent dressing, a hallmark of many popular 70s recipes. The salad was usually served chilled, which made it perfect to prepare ahead of time, another advantage for busy hosts. Grasshopper pie. In the 70s, desserts often arrived in colors you did not see in nature, and grasshopper pie was a standout example. This mint green dessert, inspired by the grasshopper cocktail, used a cookie crust filled with a minty, boozy filling that was simultaneously refreshing and indulgent. The pie borrowed its name and flavor profile from the grasshopper cocktail, an after-dinner drink made with crème de menthe, crème de cacao, and cream. By the 70s, creative home cooks had turned that cocktail experience into a frozen or chilled pie. It became a dinner party favorite. The classic version featured a chocolate cookie crust packed with a pale green mixture of marshmallows, crème du monde dure, crème de cacao, and whipped cream. Some recipes used melted marshmallows for structure, while others called for unflavored gelatin. What made grasshopper pie perfect for the 70s was its blend of adult sophistication and a slightly kitschy presentation. The vivid green color made it a conversation piece, and its cold, creamy texture was especially welcome in warm weather. For children, clever cooks substituted mint extract and green food coloring for the liqueurs. Ambrosia salad. Few dishes shout 70s potluck as loudly as ambrosia salad. This sweet, fruity mixture combines canned mandarin oranges, pineapple chunks, miniature marshmallows, and shredded coconut, all bound together with sour cream, whipped cream, or Cool Whip. Despite its 70s association, ambrosia has roots that go back much earlier, to the late 19th century. The name itself references the food of the gods in Greek mythology, implying something divine and exceptional. By the 70s, though, ambrosia had grown into a more ornate dish, bringing in modern convenience foods and extra ingredients. A typical 70s version might feature maraschino cherries for color, pecans or walnuts for crunch, and a splash of orange liqueur for an adults-only variation. What made ambrosia salad ideal for the 70s was its role as a dish to share at company events that was also simple to assemble. It needed no cooking, could be prepared well ahead of time, and relied on ingredients that were available year-round because of canned and packaged goods. Its sweet profile also let it sit between side dish and dessert, an ambiguity that fit neatly into 70s meal planning. Hamburger helper. Not every emblematic 70s food was homemade. In fact, one of the decade's most influential contributions to everyday cooking arrived in a box. Hamburger helper. Introduced by General Mills in 1971, this packaged meal starter transformed weeknight cooking by providing a fast way to turn a pound of ground beef into a full dinner. The idea was simple and clever. Each box included pasta or rice, a powdered sauce mix, and seasonings. The home cook browned the ground beef, added water and the box contents, and simmered until finished. No extra ingredients were necessary. The first 5 flavors were beef noodle, potato stroganoff, hash, rice, oriental, and chili tomato, several of which remain available today. What made Hamburger Helper perfect for the 70s was how well it matched the decade's economic and social conditions. The 1973 oil crisis brought high inflation and economic uncertainty, so meals that stretched a budget became essential for many families. At the same time, more women entered the workforce, creating demand for speedy dinner options. The brand's mascot, Lefty, a talking 4-fingered white glove, Harvey Wallbanger cake, one of the most emblematic desserts of the 1970s, it grew out of a popular cocktail of the time. The Harvey Wallbanger cake took the flavors of the well-known drink, vodka, orange juice, and Galliano, an Italian herbal liquor, and turned them into a sweet, boozy bundt cake that became a regular at adult get-togethers. The cocktail itself rose to fame in the 1960s and was said to be named for a surfer who liked the drink and had a habit of bumping into walls after a few too many. By the 1970s, inventive home bakers had adapted that cocktail into a cake. Typical recipes began with a yellow cake mix. Convenience mattered in 1970s baking, and that often meant adding instant vanilla pudding mix for extra moisture and richness. To that base, cooks stirred in orange juice, vodka, and Galliano, giving the cake a bright citrus profile with faint herbal undertones from the liquor. An orange glaze, frequently laced with a dash of spirits, was used to finish the cake. What made the Harvey Wallbanger cake feel perfectly of its decade was its blend of novelty, ease, and a small dash of rebellion. The cake was commonly baked in a bundt pan, another 1970s kitchen staple which lent it an elegant look. Green Goddess salad dressing. While many recipes from the 1970s faded away, Green Goddess dressing has seen a notable revival in recent years. This creamy herbal dressing typically combines mayonnaise, sour cream, anchovies, herbs, particularly tarragon, and green onions. Though its roots reach back further, it found special favor in the 1970s as Americans began to broaden their salad choices beyond iceberg lettuce and Thousand Island dressing. Green Goddess is said to have been created in the 1920s at San Francisco's Palace Hotel and was named after a play called The Green Goddess that was popular then. During the 1970s, bottled versions became widely available, bringing its distinctive taste into many households. Homemade Green Goddess also became a staple in cooking magazines and community cookbooks of the era. What made Green Goddess ideal for the 70s was how flexible it was, and the way it suggested freshness and health. At a time when Americans were paying more attention to nutrition, the dressing was not limited to salads. It doubled as a dip for crudités, a sauce for chilled seafood, or a sandwich spread. Chocolate fondue. While cheese fondue held sway on the savory side of 1970s entertaining, chocolate fondue took the dessert spotlight. This interactive sweet centered on a pot of melted chocolate, usually blended with cream, and sometimes a splash of liquor surrounded by dippables like strawberries, banana slices, pound cake cubes, and marshmallows. Unlike cheese fondue, chocolate fondue was a fairly recent invention. It was reportedly created in the 1960s at New York's Chalet Swiss restaurant as a way to promote a Swiss chocolate brand. By the 1970s, it had become a home entertaining staple, the ideal sweet finish to a dinner party or the focal point of a casual dessert gathering. Chocolate fondue fit the era because it combined indulgence with participation. Like cheese fondue, it drew guests together around the pot, encouraging conversation as people dipped. But chocolate fondue also felt luxurious while remaining economical. A modest amount of chocolate could go a long way when served this way. The usual method was straightforward: good quality chocolate melted with heavy cream and perhaps a touch of butter for sheen. Impossible pie. If any dessert summed up the 70s fascination with convenience and near-magic results, it was impossible pie. The name came from how effortlessly it came together. You mixed all the ingredients, poured the batter into a pie plate, and during baking the mixture separated into distinct layers: a crust, a custard filling, and a coconut topping. There was no rolling out dough or juggling multiple components, just one simple batter that transformed in the oven. The recipe first appeared on the back of Bisquick boxes in the mid-1970s, though comparable, self-layering desserts had existed earlier. What made it ideal for busy home cooks was how little work it took to produce something that looked elaborate. The basic version called for just Bisquick, eggs, sugar, milk, butter, vanilla, and shredded coconut. Once baked, the Bisquick settled into a crust, the egg and milk formed a custard center, and the coconut floated to the top and toasted. Variations popped up fast. There was Impossible Pumpkin Pie for Thanksgiving, Impossible Lemon Pie for summer gatherings, and even savory takes like Impossible Cheeseburger Pie for weekend night dinners. The 1970s gave us more than disco and bell-bottoms. It also left a remarkable stash of recipes worth reviving, from showy dinner party centerpieces to reliable weeknight family meals. These 25 dishes reflect a time when convenience and comfort shared the table with a taste for culinary daring. That era saw home cooks combining convenience foods with ambitiously fancy recipes, often within the same menu. Entertaining was intentional, not an afterthought, and many dishes were designed to bring people together around the table. Next time you plan a meal, think about pulling one of these 70s gems back into rotation. You may be surprised at how well they hold up. If this trip through the 70s stirred a smile, stay with us. There's more where this came from: vintage recipes, family table traditions, and the stories that made them unforgettable. Like, subscribe, and share with someone who remembers.